Morning. Good start. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Well, it's been a few weeks since I preached, but the last time I preached, we Bible nerded out really hard on the story of Abraham's first big failure. And what we're going to do today is we're going to jump ahead to a second one. And we're not going to Bible nerd out crazy hard, but to do this, I want you to open your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 16. And buckle up because this is an awful, awful story. It's going to start like this. We'll read through it all the way and then we'll come back and talk about it. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him a child, but she had an Egyptian slave woman whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please have relations with my slave woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave woman, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as his wife. Then he had relations with Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar became aware that she had conceived, her mistress, meaning Sarai, was insignificant in her sight. So Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I put my slave woman into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was insignificant in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Look, your slave woman is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. It's the Bible. It's a tough story. It's a tough story, man. This story has the patriarchy, it has slavery, it has sexual abuse, it has all of this nasty stuff that we don't want to think about. It is a very, very critical portrait the biblical author is painting of Abram and Sarai in this deal. And that's the thing about the Bible, is it does not shy away from showing us what humans are really like. It does not lift up the heroes of the Bible as people that are righteous or virtuous, but are just as prone to failure as everybody else. In fact, the chosen people of God, like Abraham and Sarai, are often the biggest obstacle to God doing his will in the world. His own chosen people tend to be the biggest obstacle for doing what he wants to do. And we want to believe that there's like good guys and there's bad guys, and God's only for the good guys and God's not for the bad guys. But when you read through the story of the Bible, you often see the people of God doing terrible things. And the unrighteous, the outsiders, the Canaanites are often the ones that are filling the role of righteousness in this story that God uses to do something in the world because he can't get it done through the people that he's chosen to do it with. And so, as terrible as this story is, there is definitely something here for us today. Because this story, as I've sat with it for the last week or so, has become really powerful to me. Really powerful to me personally in my life. And so, let's just go back and see what we can learn through it by going slowly. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him a child, but she had an Egyptian slave woman named Hagar. So if you've been reading through Genesis, this is not new information to us. The first thing the biblical author tells you about Sarai in Genesis chapter 11, I believe, is that she's barren. She cannot produce children. And so just for a moment, be sympathetic with Sarai here. Put yourself into her shoes. Having children is a big deal. It's a big deal today. It is a bigger deal in the time period that Sarai lived. Her identity, her worth, her value to society was tied up in her ability to produce children. That is what made a woman in this culture. Can you produce children? And so since the time we've met her, years have passed. God has repeatedly come to them and promised them that he's going to give them a son, that he's going to give them children that are as numerous as the stars, as numerous as the sand on the beaches. God continuously makes promises to Sarai and Abraham, but it has not come to pass. It has been years where she has wrestled with this, where her and Abram have dealt with not being able to produce children. And it kind of paints her as a sympathetic figure in this point. She spent so many years waiting for this. And instead of trusting that God would be good to his word, that he would be true and that he would be faithful to them, even though he's been faithful to them every step of the way, he's rescued them, he's delivered them, he's given them victory in battles, he's done miraculous things to them. But the one thing he hasn't done is given them children. And instead of trusting that he will, she takes matters into her own hands. She decides, I can fix this problem myself. She comes up with a scheme. She's not being malicious. She's trying to do something good. She wants to fulfill the thing that God has promised. God's promised it. She's like, it's my will to have a child. It's God's will for me to have a child. I want to give a child to Abram. I can make this happen. I can do it. And she tries to do something good. She's not thinking to herself, man, I want to blow up my family. I want to create all these problems down the line. Man, I want to destroy relationships and create all these things. That never crosses her mind. She's thinking, here's something good I can do, and she tries to do it on her own. She's doing something that seems good in her eyes. So she comes up with this scheme involving an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And you're like, wait, why does Abram even have a slave? What is going on here? Well, if you remember what we talked about last time, Abram's first big failure, God promised to provide for Abram, said, stay in the land, I will provide for you. And a famine hits the land, and instead of trusting in the Lord, Abram leaves and he goes down to Egypt. And he comes up with a scheme. It's like, man, I'm going to get rich out of this deal. I'm going to tell everybody that Sarah is my sister. And they're going to think she's beautiful, and then maybe it'll work out really well for me. And exactly what he schemes up comes to pass. He gets what he wants. The men of Pharaoh see Sarah. They see that she's beautiful. They take her, and they give her to Pharaoh as his wife. And God has to step in and rescue Sarah from this potential for abuse that has just been, he's made his own wife vulnerable to try to get rich. And it works out. God rescues Sarah, but the Pharaoh pays off Abram. It's like, hey, I'm going to give you all this stuff to just get out of here. And here's what that looks like. It says, Pharaoh officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. The woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Therefore, he treated Abram well for her sake, and he gave him sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female servants. That word's slave. Female slaves, female donkeys and camels. So his scheme works. He comes up with a scheme. I'm going to get rich, sells his wife to another man by saying it's his sister and he's in charge of her, and he gets slaves. And so while God rescues Sarah out of this, he doesn't take away the consequences from Abram's actions. All this wealth that he gets from Pharaoh becomes an immediate snare to him and a huge problem. He can't get along with his brother because they have too much stuff now that he's wealthy. His brother has to separate from him. It leads to this whole big deal. And here in this story, now he has a slave. And Sarah's like, hey, we got this slave girl. Let's just use her to do this. So it's Sarah not trusting in God, Sarah coming up with a scheme to get what she wants, and all at the expense of Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, see now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. She's attributing her infertility to God. And it's this idea that God's holding out on me. God's promised me this good thing, but he hasn't given it to me. There's something good he has, but he won't give it to me. God's holding out on me. So I'm just going to take it into my own hands and do it for myself. Let's use Hagar. And the idea here is that in this time period, this was not uncommon, is that if Hagar bore a child, it would be Sarah's child. Hagar didn't have any rights in this situation. That's the master's child. So that's the idea. She's just going to claim that child. And so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar her slave woman, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as his wife. Now, if you remember the Bible nerdy out stuff, do any words jump out there at you? She took. She gave. This is Genesis 3 language. This is the fall. Eve saw that the fruit was good. She took it, and she gave it to her husband Adam. The biblical author wants you to hold those two stories in your mind when you read this. Whenever you see that, took and gave, it should trigger alarm bells and be like, this is a fall. This is something terrible is happening right here. And so just to look at it, in Genesis 3, you have these three archetypes that play out all throughout the Old Testament. Every story in Genesis is this archetype playing out from creation to a fall to a second fall to some sort of cosmic rebellion that God has to get involved in, like the flood, Noah's flood, like the Tower of Babel. Like it's replaying this throughout the entire Hebrew Bible is this theme. And so in the Garden of Eden, you have three basic elements. You have something good that people desire. You have humans taking that into their own hands and doing what they want with it. And you have a serpent, someone deceiving somebody. In Genesis chapter 3, it's the serpent, Satan, however you want to say it. So if you map this out to Abram's first fall, it was Pharaoh's men saw that Sarah was beautiful. They took Sarah. They gave her to Pharaoh. Sarah was the thing that was beautiful. In the first fall, Sarah was the thing that was tempting to people. And Abram was the one that was lying and deceiving. Abram played the role of the serpent in the first fall story. And in this one, now you have Sarah has something that she thinks is good and she desires. It's Hagar. She's using Hagar as a means to an end to try to build a family. Sarah's trying to build her own Eden. She's trying to provide her own provision. She's trying to provide her own security. And she looks at Hagar and says, okay, I can use that. That's what I'm going to use. And so she takes her and she gives her to Abram. But who is the deceiver in this thing? It's not outright mentioned. You should know because this is replayed several times. It's in that first thing that she says about why she's doing it. God's holding out on me. It's the same thing that the servant got Eve with. Man, God knows you're not going to die. He just knows you'll become like him if you eat of that fruit. He's holding out on you. There's something good behind that. If you take it, it'll be good for you. It's the same lie. In the biblical author, you should know that. Oh, God's holding out. That's the lie. That's the deal. And she's trying to build her own Eden, and she takes a person that she should not have taken, and they violate her. And that's the thing. It's this idea that just keeps playing throughout the Bible. And it's worth noting here that this multiple wives thing is not condoned in the Bible. The Genesis the ideal was a man and a woman joined together as one. They produce offspring. But if you follow the story down, Cain's descendants, it goes boom, boom, boom. Cain's descendant Lamech, big bad dude. He's the one that sings songs about murdering everybody. One thing the biblical author notes about him is that he started collecting wives like property. And that's like not a good idea. And every time this theme is mentioned in the Bible, it always plays out in a horrible way. Here with Sarah and Hagar, later with David and his wives, and David and Solomon, it's always a super critical portrait of this idea. And so I just wanted to mention that. But Sarah's scheme backfires. Hagar gets pregnant. And the moment that she gets pregnant, she realizes, wait a second, now I have all the power. She went from being a victim to all of a sudden her status now becomes, what? I'm the one that is providing this child to Abram. Now I am the preferred wife. I'm the one that is doing this. And she begins to look down on Sarah. She immediately, as soon as she is elevated from victim status to having power, she begins to use that power now to try to oppress her oppressor. And that word there, she became insignificant in her sight. The word is cursed in Hebrew. Think what we've heard about Abram. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. So as soon as she gets power, she starts cursing the people that were abusing her in theory here. And this is not to say that Hagar is bad or something. This is human nature. Like, you know this story. You know this. We all want that Eden blessing. We all want peace. We all want security. And Sarah thought she had a way to make that for herself. But Hagar wants that same thing too. And now Hagar thinks that she has power to make that happen for herself. And she starts wielding that power for herself to try to get ahead, to try to build her own Eden. It's an ugly picture of human nature. Hagar didn't start this situation. None of this is her fault. But the moment that she gets elevated, she starts doing the same thing that was just done to her. She contributes to the mess. So Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done to me, the word is violence, may the violence done to me be upon you. I put my slave woman into your arms, but when she saw she had conceived, I was insignificant in her sight. May the Lord judge between me and you. Whose idea was this in the first place? Sarah. Abram has been completely passive this whole story. He's like, sweet, I get 2 wives? Cool. And he doesn't do anything. And she's using God like God was behind this. Like this was God's idea. And that's the thing. Like, she has this idea, of course God's on my side. He's made all these promises. I can do whatever I want. She's just a slave girl. It's just a horrible portrait. The Bible does not shy away from what we are like deep down. Whatever we think benefits us, we twist in our minds to be good in God's will. It's like God's will happens to be whatever I think is right and benefits me, even if it's at the expense of other people. Surely that must be God's will because he loves me. And I want to point out just a little Bible nerdy melody thing. Not only do we have all this Genesis chapter 3, the fall, Adam and Eve language, now we also have the themes of Cain and Abel. Remember, if you remember the story of Cain and Abel, you have 2 brothers that are rivals over which one is God's chosen one. And the one that is not chosen wrongs the chosen one and murders him and then has to be cast out to the east. And here you have not rival brothers, but rival wives, rivaling over who's the chosen one, rivaling over who has status. But here it's God's chosen one that is doing the violence on the oppressed one. And the oppressed one has to flee. It's a wild story. And this verse, I think, is one of the hardest verses. Look, Hagar is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly, abused her. What was good in Sarah's sight was to abuse another person. It's just wild. It's how easy it is for us to convince ourselves that even just the most terrible things in human nature are God's will and are good. And the Bible's just putting it right out there. Hey, these heroes of the faith, this is who they were. And just as a side note, mainly just for Trey, there's a lot of Genesis 6 language in this. That word mistress, it calls Sarah, is the Gabor, the men of the name. It's the female version of that. So it's tying Sarah to this huge biblical, what led to the flood. It's very interesting. And once you go back and read the Genesis 3 narrative and the Genesis 4 and Genesis 6 with this in mind, it just opens up all these new nuances to you that you never thought about. And that's how the Bible's designed. That's why it's called meditative literature. The more you read it, the more you start to understand stuff you didn't understand before. Because every story is just painting a broader picture, painting different aspects of the same thing. And so it's just really neat. Love the Bible. Anyways, so Hagar has to flee and says, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. She flees to the wilderness by the spring on the way to Shur. She makes it halfway back to Egypt. She's running home. She's running home to where she was previously a slave. Like, there's no good options here for Hagar. And the angel said, Hagar, Sarah's slave woman, where have you come from? Where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarah. So the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. What now? The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants. so that they will be too many to count. God tells her to go back to a place where she was being abused, but he blesses her. Blesses her, and he continues the blessing. He says, the angel of the Lord said to her, further, behold, you are pregnant. You will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Ishmael means the Lord hears. But he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live in defiance of all his brothers. It's a blessing, but it's also a prediction of the same consequences from Genesis 3 and 4. There's going to be a separation. There's going to be rivalry. There's going to be this thing that is going to play out. It's Genesis 3, 4, and 6 all over again. And Hagar gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Be'er Lahai-roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So, man, this story. I had a really, really hard time with God telling Hagar going back to Sarah, going back to a place where she was abused. So God meets Hagar in her pain, in the wilderness, and he blesses her. But he tells her to do something, to go back to this place where she was being abused. And I struggle with that. I just wrestled with that for a long time. Like, what is this? But what's he asking her to do? He's asking her to trust him. All of a sudden now, that same thing that he's been asking Abram and Sarah to do, that they have perpetually failed to do, he's asking Hagar to do. I'm going to bless you. I give you my word. I have met with you in person. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to keep you. I need you to go back. And the thing is, where Abram and Sarah continually fail in trusting God, Hagar goes back. The Egyptian slave woman goes, okay, I'll do it. And she goes back. And she has to trust that God is going to redeem this situation, that God is going to work it out in a way better than she could. She had the opportunity right there, the choice, to be like, no, I'm going to take this in my own hands. I'm going to continue fleeing on my own. I'm going to make my own way. I'm going to do my own thing. I've got this. I've got this. And to me, if you're Hagar, it'd be like, no, you're their God, and they treated me this way. Why would I trust you? But she doesn't. She trusts that God is going to redeem the situation, that he's going to be good to his word, that he's going to protect her, that he's going to provide for her. And she trusts him. She trusts him that he's going to work it out better than she could. And she names God. This is the first person in the Bible that gives God a name. It's Hagar, the Egyptian slave woman. Her name means the immigrant. And she gives a name to God. God is the one who sees me. The one who sees me. And God is the only one in this story that uses her name. He does call her Sarah's slave woman. He says her name. Abram and Sarah never even mention her name. They're just like that slave woman. He's like, hey, Hagar, I know who you are. And it's like God saying, I'm not blind to your suffering. I know exactly who you are. I know exactly what you've been through. I'm not blind to your pain. I'm not blind to your suffering. I see you and I know you. I've known you the whole time. And that's why she names him that. And the language there is really interesting. I've seen the one who has seen me. The Hebrew is super weird from what scholars say, but it echoes Moses seeing the back of God. Like her language there is, I have seen the back of the one who sees me. But it's like that story of Moses where he's like, I'll show you my glory, but you can only see my back as he walks away. And it's Hagar that gets this encounter with the Lord. It's just a wild story. As the ministry team comes up, we'll close with this. I know this is short, but here's the deal. What does this story mean to you? I don't know. I don't know where you're at in life. I don't know what you've been going through. But for me, this story has become really powerful because to me this is the story of every single one of our lives. Every single day. Every single day. Now, obviously, I hope you're not collecting wives like property. But this same choice is presented before us every single day of our lives. Are you going to trust in God to provide for you? Or are you going to take matters into your own hands and try to build your own Eden? Are you going to try to get what seems good in your eyes on your own terms? Are you going to trust in what he says is good? Are you going to trust that he will come through for you? That in his time, in his way, he will work your situation out in a way that is better than you could. And this is a hard thing because, think about times where you're stuck at a dead-end job and you're like, God, man, I could do my job better than my boss. I could do this so much better. And you have this opportunity to get frustrated and take matters into your own hands and start gossiping about your coworker, start trying to get ahead, start whatever, stealing. You can start looking at people's lives around you and say, man, my peers make way more money than me. Man, I got to do something else. These people have relationships that I want. Those relationships seem good to me. I'm going to get something like that. And you start striving in your own power. You start trying to get ahead. But the Bible is like, that is always the wrong answer. Always. Even if you get what you want, you won't really get what you want. There will be consequences that you can't see in the future, just like with Abram and his riches, just like with this story with Hagar and Sarah. She gets what she wants. They get a child. But it creates so many consequences down the line that all could have been avoided if they would have just trusted God to do what he said he would do. And that's the question before us every day. Do you trust him to do what he says he will do? Do you trust him to be good on his promises? Do I have to build my own Eden, or do I trust him to provide me one? And it's this story about, do you trust that he sees you and that he knows you? In these times where your circumstances do not match up to the promises of God, where your life does not match up to what you think it should be, do you trust that he sees you and that he knows you? That he is not a stranger to your pain? That he is not a stranger to your suffering? That he will take care of it. And that's why reading the Bible is so important, because you get to see them struggle with this and fail at it. But then God is still faithful to them. Even after all of this nonsense, God still provides the chosen son. He still makes good on his word. He still does all of that. Even though they had to wait a long time, you see him come through for them. And then you see him come through for their son Isaac. Then you see him come through for their son Jacob. Then you see him come through for Joseph after 17 years. Then you see him come through for David after all of his failures and his 30 years in the wilderness or whatever. You see him come through. You see it over and over again. And it builds your faith. It builds your faith that despite the failures, God is committed to making his will known in the earth through broken people. That despite how broken and messed up Hagar and Sarah are, despite how disgusting that story is, God comes through. And he turns a terrible thing into redemption, into glory. He takes ashes and he gives you beauty. God is so much committed to doing things through broken people that he just keeps coming into the story in deeper and deeper ways until he finally steps out of heaven and becomes a man. And he lives the life that we were all meant to live, the life that Abram and Sarah were meant to live, a life of trust and dependence upon God. And he lives this life of faith and trust, and on the cross, he takes the punishment for all of the mess that we've created in his good world. And all of the mess we've created in ourselves. And all of the mess we create on everybody else by doing what we think is good in our own eyes. We do what we think is good in our own eyes. It always creates hell on earth. And he takes the punishment for that. And through his resurrection life, he promises that death will not have the last word. That every wrong will be righted. That the snake will be crushed. And that every tear will be wiped away. And so I don't know where you're at in your life. If you're in this period where you're like, man, I need God, you've got to come through for me. The answer is just to trust. Don't kick open doors that aren't opened by him. Don't rip open windows that he hasn't opened for you. And just be faithful and trust. That's what he wants from us. He doesn't need your talent. He doesn't need your gifts. He doesn't need your abilities. He can give you all that and more. All he's looking for is your trust. That he will provide. So if you need prayer today, I want to encourage you to come up and let these people pray for you. Because it says for 2 or more are gathered, he's there. He's here in this place today. He sees you. He knows you. And so if you need something from him, if it's just peace, come get prayer. Father God, we just thank you for who you are, God, for your character. That despite how broken we are, you are faithful. Despite how weak we are, God, we cannot run your goodwill. We cannot outrun your love. Father, you can turn ashes into beauty. God, you can turn mourning into dancing, Father, if we trust. And we just submit ourselves to you and say, God, your will be done, not mine. Your will be done in my life, not mine. Because you are faithful to give all of those things. When we seek your kingdom, all of those things that we're striving after, God, you provide. But on your terms, not ours. So, Father, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for the grace of the cross. Father, come do what you love to do. Heal your people. Amen. Y'all have a good week.